Well, in Secret History, I also have a long list of reasons why we should want change, and I think we can all think of many reasons why we do. But I would just like to mention a couple right now that I think are really highlight the problem. One is that we in the United States are less than 5% of the world's population. We consume over 25% of the world's resources and create more than 30% of the world's pollution. By any standards, any rational human being, it doesn't take an economist or a scientist to figure out that that's a terrible failure. Our system is not the greatest system in the world by any means. It is a failure. You cannot continue with 5% of the world's population consuming 25% of its resources, creating over 30% of its pollution. You can't sell that model to China or India or Africa or Latin America, and we can't continue doing it here. It is a failure. The best reason for change is that we have to change. We cannot continue like that. Well, there's a lot of other reasons, too. At 9/11, when 3,000 people died horrible, tragic lives, down here at Ground Zero and at the Pentagon, another 50,000 people died from hunger around the world, and hunger-related problems and diseases for which we have cures that they didn't have access to those cures. Every single day, 50,000 people, many of them children, die needless, terrible, painful deaths because of the system we've created. I'm going to leave it at that for now. There's a lot longer list in the book, but that should be sufficient to convince us all that we must change. Yes, there is reason for change. And so the second question, well, I think before we even get into the second question, we may need to ask ourselves, how did this happen? And how has it seemed to happen really in secret? And that's really the story of us economic hitmen, of what I did. We economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire, and we have done it pretty much in secret. And we work many different ways, and a lot of these are detailed in the books, a lot of examples. But perhaps the most common method that we use is that we identify a third world country that has resources that our corporations covet, like oil, and then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations, but the money never goes to the country. Instead, it goes to a number of our companies, usually led by a big engineering firm, to build infrastructure projects in that country, power systems, industrial parks, harbors. Now those things benefit our companies very much. They get the money. Most all the money goes to them. It also benefits a few people, a few very rich people in those countries who are our collaborators. They own the industries. They get to use the electricity. They own the industrial parks. They have the ports. They use the boats and the cars. The majority of the people aren't even connected to the electrical grid. They don't have the skills needed to get jobs in the industrial parks. They don't benefit at all. But they and the whole country are left holding this huge, huge debt. And it's such a big debt that they can't possibly repay it. That's according to plan. We intended it to be that way because at some time we economic hitmen go back to that country and we say, look, you owe us a lot of money. You can't repay your debts. So give us a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical UN vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. Most Americans seem to believe that all these other countries that sent troops to Iraq were doing it because they believed in what we were doing in Iraq. That's very untrue. Most of them did it because they were essentially blackmailed into doing it because they owe us a lot of money because I helped put them in that position. Throughout history, when countries have built empires, and there have been a lot of those, they've usually done it by the military, through the military, and everybody knew it was happening. But when you do it through economic hitmen like me, most people don't know it's happening. Most Americans, most people in the United States, I hate to use that word American because after all, the Brazilians and the Ecuadorians and the Canadians are all Americans too, and I'm primarily talking about the US here. But most of us believe that foreign aid is primarily altruistic. It is not. It's used to build empire. When we economic hitmen fail, which isn't too often. I failed terribly in Panama with Omar Torrijos, the president there, and also in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos. And those stories are detailed in the books. But when we fail, then the jackals are sent in. The jackals are men who, sometimes a few women, who overthrow governments or assassinate the leaders. So when I failed with Omar Torrijos, I failed to corrupt him. I failed to bring him around in Panama. I was aware that not only if I failed would I not be doing my job, but that something dire would happen to him. And in fact, he was assassinated by CIA-sponsored assassins. And Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, 2 months apart, these two men were both assassinated because of the failure of economic hitmen. When the jackals fail, it's not too often, it's very seldom, in fact, that both the economic hitmen and the jackals fail. Then and only then do we send in the military. That's what happened in Iraq. And that story is detailed in the books. We may get into it in the questions and answers, but I'm not going to go there right now. But that's what happened in Iraq. The military is on standby to go in when all else fails. We can see this very clearly right now in Latin America. 7 countries in South America, representing over 80% of the population, recently voted in the president in democratic elections who ran on an anti-exploitation ticket. In other words, these presidents said, Ecuador's oil ought to go to the Ecuadorian people. Bolivia's gas ought to go to the Bolivian people, the profits from those resources, not to the big international corporations. Over 80% of South America voted for such presidents in the last election. In another country in Central America. They're sending us a very, very strong message. But what we need to know in this country is that after each one of those presidents was elected, someone who looked like me, I don't think I'm too sinister looking, unless you look at my picture on the back of that new book, taken by the New York Times. Don't look at it now, please. But someone who looks a lot like me, who knows this president, the president has seen him around before, he speaks Spanish, walks into the president's office and he says, congratulations, Mr. President, or in the case of Chile, Ms. President, you're now president. And I want to remind you that I can make you and your family very, very wealthy if you play our game. Or if you choose to follow your campaign promises, remember what happened to Allende of Chile. Remember what happened to Arbenz and Lumumba. Remember what happened to Torrijos. Remember what happened to Roldos and Noriega. Remember, remember. In other words, someone walks into that president's office and says, I can make you very rich or I can kill you. You better play our game. What do you do? What do you do if you're in that position? Well, it's up to us to do something here in the United States. We must make sure that this doesn't happen any longer. These people are sending us a very strong message. So that's just a little bit about how did we get here to this position.